Winters in Colorado are never gentle. But that year, the cold seemed to swallow every sound and every sign of life. The leaden gray sky pressed down on the mountains like a heavy quilt. Snow had fallen relentlessly for 3 straight days, covering everything in white, from the pine trees in front of the house to the old wooden porch, already beginning to rot. Even the wind no longer howled, only whispered long, icy breaths that crept through every crack in the doors, every seam in the wood, as if winter were whispering something no human could ever understand. The wooden cabin sat perched between the trees, cut off from the noisy world beyond. A small, cozy haven where a family of 3, a mother, a father, and a 6-year-old girl named Ellie, had chosen to retreat from the chaos. To them, winter was a time to draw closer, to listen to the crackling of firewood in the hearth, to share sweet stories under the warm glow of soft yellow light. That evening, as the clock struck 10, the father put his book down on the table, preparing to bolt the door. The snow had piled halfway up his shin, and it was so cold that even the deer that usually wandered nearby had vanished by the afternoon. Suddenly, a strange sound arose. Not loud, but enough to make the mother lift her head from beneath the wool blanket. A faint, weak sound stretched like a choked cry carried by the wind. Not an owl, not the rustle of wind through leaves. It sounded like whimpering. A brittle, hesitant sound. Then silence. The father paused, listening. But there was only the wind. "Did you hear that?" the mother whispered, her eyes anxious as she stared through the fogged-up window pane. He shook his head. But then, the sound returned. This time clearer, longer, like a tiny plea for help. A cry. A cry so faint that, without attention, it would dissolve into the freezing wind. But something in that sound tightened the mother's chest. She stood up, threw on a thick coat, and quietly moved toward the front door. The father followed quickly behind, reminding their daughter to stay inside. When the door opened, the cold swept in like a blade. The chill slapped against her face, making the mother shiver. And then she saw it. Right beneath the porch, amid ankle-deep snow, was a tiny, curled-up creature, a soaking, matted ball of fur, trembling in waves as if it were about to break. A baby bobcat, wild lynx. No bigger than a house cat, but with pointed ears, a rough coat of speckled golden-brown fur, and those eyes froze the mother in place. Not wildness, not predator instinct, but panic, hunger, cold, and a sorrow so deep it felt bottomless. The bobcat didn't growl or run. It just lay there, shriveled like a dying ember, its breath so faint it was barely audible. The father stood behind her, speaking low. "It's a lynx. Could be dangerous." The mother said nothing. She knelt down, locking eyes with the tiny being. And at that moment, it was as if an invisible thread had pulled 2 strangers together. A mother, a forsaken creature. No words needed, just a look, trembling, desperate. And in that instant, she knew she couldn't turn away. She reached out, slowly, gently, and pulled the old wool scarf from her shoulders. The smell of aged fabric, of a warm home, of human scent, wrapped around the little body. And for the first time, it closed its eyes, not from exhaustion, but because it had found a place to breathe. The wind still hissed through the pines, tossing snow like a wild white veil over the forest. But inside the small wooden cabin, The world seemed to fall silent. Only the crackling of fire and the fragile breaths of a life curled within humanity's arms remained. The baby bobcat was placed in an old basket lined with 2 soft towels and a wool sweater that Ellie offered without hesitation. It lay there, shivering and weak, but still warm. The only thing in this storm that could make people believe hope hadn't been buried. The mother sat beside the basket nearly all night, occasionally leaning in to check for the faint rise and fall of its breath. Under the dim yellow glow of the oil lamp, its filthy fur had begun to dry. But the small body barely moved, only its curled tail twitching now and then, haunted by the memory of -20-degree cold. The father said nothing. He stood quietly by the window, glancing now and then at the white expanse outside, waiting for something. A sign that the adult bobcats were coming to find their young, or perhaps the authorities if this went too far. But only snow fell, and silence. Near dawn, the mother finally drifted off, her head resting against the armchair, scarf still loosely draped over her shoulder. In her restless sleep, she dreamed of a misty forest and amber eyes watching her from afar. No voice called, just a tender, sorrowful presence. When she opened her eyes, daylight had crept in through the window, and something had changed. The bobcat had moved from the wool scarf, just a few inches, but it was the first time it moved on its own. Its tiny nose twitched gently, inhaling, and for the first time, it made a sound, like a soft whimper, not fear, but a reply. The mother placed her hand on the rim of the basket, not touching, just near. And in that moment, the bobcat looked up. Its eyes weren't bright like the healthy lynxes seen in books. They were cloudy, weary, and starved, but still conscious. In those eyes, there was something no one expected: trust. The days that followed were a series of quiet moments where life was stitched back together with drops of milk, minutes of sitting in silence, and gentle touches from hands once used to holding a child, now tending to a creature seemingly unrelated to humans. The bobcat, whom Ellie named Ember, began to eat a little. First, a few teaspoons of diluted goat milk dripped from a silver spoon. Then, the shredded boiled chicken mixed with soft porridge. It wasn't easy. Some nights, Ember vomited everything, shivering and falling back into a daze. There were times the father nearly lost his patience, tired of the care with no clear end. But whenever he saw his wife sitting beside Ember, her hand resting on the towel, eyes singing a silent lullaby, he couldn't bear to say a word. He had never seen her like this. Not since their second child was lost to a miscarriage 2 years ago. No one spoke of it, but Ember had touched something they couldn't name. An emptiness, a wound unhealed. And every time Ember stirred, each time it stretched a paw beyond the scarf, the mother seemed to breathe deeper. Ellie whispered songs to Ember each night. She never asked why the lynx had come to their home, never asked if they could keep it forever. Children don't always need to know why, only that their hearts feel right. And Ellie's heart knew. Ember wasn't just an animal. It was life returning, something delicate and soft that she somehow understood better than anyone else. A week passed. Ember started taking slow steps around the fireplace, still afraid, still freezing up at loud noises, but no longer burrowed in the scarf. For the first time it licked Ellie's hand, a rough, damp tongue, a tentative lick like a thank you. Ellie burst out laughing, and for the first time since the miscarriage, the mother smiled. Not a big laugh, just a gentle smile. But for the father, it was a miracle. He turned away, not letting anyone see the redness in his eyes. Ember began spending every morning by the window, gazing into the forest, its sharp ears perked up, amber eyes tracing distant movement, as if listening to something humans couldn't hear. One night, Ellie asked her mother, "Mom, do you think Ember misses home?" The mother pulled her close, hugging tightly than usual. "Maybe, but sometimes home is where you're loved, not where you were born." That line echoed, not only in Ellie's heart, but in the father's, who sat quietly on the porch, holding a mug of hot cocoa, watching Ember nestle into the blanket. The small wooden house, once home to 3, now had a 4th soul, not human, but bringing a strange warmth. A warmth that softened the winter, that made dinners cozier and slowly thawed hearts once frozen. Outside, winter continued. Snow still fell steadily. But something had changed. In the little cabin deep in the woods, a family was healing, not through words, but through a tiny, wild, beautiful being. Something nature had sent as an unannounced gift. And they welcomed it with love, instinct, and the forgiveness they had long denied themselves. That morning, the world was very still. No wind, no bird song, just a pale white spread across the earth, cloaking the forest as if all of nature were holding its breath. The mother rose early. She was used to seeing Ember curled beside the window each morning, head resting on the wool scarf, eyes dreamily gazing at the distant woods. But today, the spot was empty. She stepped closer. The blanket still held warmth, as if the little creature had only left minutes ago. The back door was ajar. A freezing gust swept across the floor, carrying with it a few unmelted flakes. "Ember," she called, voice so soft she wasn't sure if it was a call or a prayer. No response, no sound, no sign, only absence. The husband checked around the porch. There were no clear footprints. The fresh snow had erased every trace from the night before. He waded through the backyard, following a few faint sunken paths in the snow that led toward the pine forest. But they stopped abruptly, as if Ember had vanished into the trees, into the night, into silence, without leaving a single goodbye. Little Ellie didn't understand at first. She searched the living room, under the table, behind chairs, inside the blanket cabinet, still whispering that familiar name out of habit, until her mother pulled her into an embrace and softly said, "Maybe Ember just went for a little walk, sweetheart." But Ellie's tears had already fallen. Quiet, small, not sobbing, just warm drops falling into the cold snow that had settled inside a child's heart. And the mother, for the first time in many months, felt her own heart tighten, as if an old wound had returned. Not because they lost Ember, but because her daughter was learning what it meant to lose. 3 days passed. The forest beyond the porch became so still that it was unsettling. No signs of wildlife, no scurrying weasels, no bear scratches, only snow, thicker, colder by the day. The father had quietly left some pieces of boiled chicken on a plate behind the house. But each morning the plate remained untouched, cold, soulless. "Maybe she found her kind," he said. But his voice held no conviction. No one was certain. Silence can sometimes hurt more than rejection. On the 4th night, the mother sat alone by the fireplace. She held the old wool scarf in her hands, the same one she had wrapped around the trembling creature that first day beneath the porch. She didn't cry, only clenched her hands tighter. She remembered the weight of that small body in her arms, remembered the faint, flickering breaths, remembered the terrified eyes, then the slow softening as she laid her hand on the matted fur, and she wondered silently, if I had known it was only temporary, would I still have opened the door? She knew the answer, and it hurt, because true love doesn't require time, only presence. On the 5th morning, the snow stopped falling. The sky was clearer than usual, a pale blue stretched like a cold sheet. But colder still were the hearts of the 3 inside the small cabin, each silent in their own way, no one daring to say, "Ember isn't coming back," because to say it would make it real. That afternoon, as the family sat quietly around the table, eating in near silence, Ellie suddenly looked up. "Mum, did you hear that?" The mother tilted her ear. The wind still seeped through the cracks. Branches tapped lightly against the walls. In the distance, a faint rustling, barely audible, as if someone were stepping softly through snow. She stood abruptly. The front door flew open and the cold wind rushed in. And then she saw a small figure, soaked and shivering, stood on the porch. Ember. But she wasn't alone. Behind her was another creature, smaller, thinner, crouched low, breathing heavily. Another baby bobcat. The sight froze everyone in place. Ember, the one who had once been rescued, had returned, bringing with her another life. Not her child, too small to be hers. Perhaps a sibling, perhaps not. But the look in Ember's eyes as she gazed at the mother was exactly the same as that first day under the porch. No words needed, just a question in her eyes. "Can I bring it in?" The mother knelt. She slipped the old wool scarf from her neck and laid it on the wooden floor, without hesitation. Ember stepped forward, slowly, exhausted, and lay her body on the familiar scarf. The smaller bobcat hesitated, but when Ember glanced over, it moved forward, crawling into the folds of the scarf, nestling against Ember, as if that was all it knew of the world. No one spoke, but everyone knew. Once again, the door had opened. And this time, it wasn't just about saving a life. It was a transformation. Ember, the creature who once lay flattened in the snowstorm, had found her way back, bringing another soul along. From victim to protector, from abandoned to guardian. That night, the father sat by the window, firelight casting solemn lines across his face. He watched Ember curled up with the second bobcat, 2 imperfect creatures, huddled together, seeking the last warmth left in the world. He held his wife's hand, said nothing. She leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered as if to herself, "We didn't just save an animal. We were given back something we thought we had lost long ago. Hope." Since the day Ember returned with the little one, the cabin on the hill was no longer as quiet as before. Each morning, Ellie rushed to the porch to check if they were still there. And every day, the 2 small figures, one golden, one speckled, lay curled together, breathing gently like 2 glowing embers. The mother began waking earlier, slowly preparing extra food, minced chicken, a few drops of fish oil, warm porridge, and clean water. The new bobcat, smaller and more fragile, was named Ash, a name like the remnant of Ember. The 2 became a familiar sight in the house, threading through the warmth. But then, small changes began to appear, and none of them were ready. Ember grew stronger, her fur gleamed again, her steps became firm, her eyes, once dull from hunger and cold, now shone sharp and deep like the forest. She no longer nestled against human legs, no longer slept beside the fire or burrowed in blankets. Ember began choosing hidden corners to rest. She watched more, moved quietly, and touched less. Ash, on the other hand, remained small, still clinging to human warmth. Still climbed into Ellie's lap and nuzzled her hand at every chance. One creature was finding its way back to humans. A creature is slowly turning away. One afternoon, while the father was shoveling snow out front, he heard a sound near the tree line, a sharp, sudden rustle. When he looked up, he saw Ember frozen in place on the snowy ground, eyes locked onto a shivering squirrel perched low on a branch. Then, in a flash, Ember lunged, silent, without warning. And when she returned, the limp, tiny body dangled from her mouth, blood staining the white snow. He stood still, unsure whether to feel fear, astonishment, or sorrow. Ember had changed, no longer the fragile creature he had once carried in from the porch. She had remembered who she was. The mother tried to hide her worry, but she saw it. Ember began to growl when Ash came too close to her food. She reacted more aggressively when touched without warning. Once, when Ellie stepped too close without calling her name, Ember turned so fast the child stumbled backward and fell. There was no injury. But that look, it no longer belonged to a member of the family. It was the look of the forest. And then, one morning, everything changed. A vehicle pulled up to the wooden gate, its wheels sinking into the soft snow. On the door were the words, Wildlife Conservation Unit, Colorado Division. A woman stepped out. She wore a thick, moss-green coat, her eyes cold as the air. But behind her sternness was something else, caution. The father went out to greet her. They spoke quietly, but the mother and Ellie could guess the conversation from their posture and glances. Someone had seen Ember. Perhaps it was a ranger drone, perhaps a forest camera, perhaps someone filed a report. But however it happened, they now knew there was a bobcat living near human homes, and possibly with humans. The woman's name was Lena, a wildlife specialist. She wasn't rude or accusatory. On the contrary, the way she looked at Ember, who lay by the window, ears flat, eyes wary, was full of understanding. "This animal survived winter," Lena said, her voice low. "She's incredibly resilient, but her instincts can't be erased by a warm home." The mother clenched her hands. "We're not keeping her captive. She chose to stay." Lena nodded softly. "I know. That's what troubles me. Because if she chose to stay, then one day she might also choose to leave." That sentence sliced through the thought the family had been trying not to think. Lena left a folder, information about the Wildlife Reintegration Program, about animals like Ember, rescued, recovered, and eventually returned to the wild to preserve instinct and ecological balance. "You're not required to hand her over right away," Lena said before leaving. "But there will come a time when the animal will choose." That night, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt heavy, as though the thick wooden walls had soaked up all the warmth. Ellie cradled Ash in her lap, sitting close to her mother. Ember lay on the windowsill, the same place where she once curled into a wool scarf, now her perch for watching everything. Her golden eyes reflected the firelight. The mother stood, placing her hand on the glass. Outside, the snow had begun to melt. On the ground, she could clearly see Ember's paw prints returning from the forest to the porch. And she knew. One day, those prints would only go one way. They would not come back. Late at night, after the family had fallen asleep, Ember quietly rose. She padded down the hallway, glanced around. Ash was curled in Ellie's arms, fast asleep. She stepped closer, then paused, looked for a long while, and turned away, ears low, her form fading into the dark wooden tones. No one knew. But that night, Ember went into the forest, all night, and left no prints returning. The next morning, she was back. No signs of harm, but from then on, she never slept indoors. Each night she left. Each morning she returned to wait on the porch, and no one in the family asked, because everyone knew the goodbye was near. That morning, the sky was clear as glass. Snow had stopped falling 3 days earlier, leaving behind a soft white blanket covering the earth, pure and silent. The mother woke earlier than usual, a habit from that first winter when life first curled beneath the porch. She opened the door, cold air hitting her face, jolting her awake. The porch was empty. No small body curled in the scarf, no paw prints returning like every morning, only untouched snow. She stepped outside. Her slippers sank slightly into the snow. To the left of the porch, a shallow trail led into the forest. Very faint, but enough to tell her the one thing she feared most. Ember had gone. This time, for real. The father said nothing. He placed his hand on her shoulder, silently watching the pines where the morning sun had begun to touch the frozen branches. Ellie sat still, holding Ash, her tiny face unable to express the sorrow in her heart. Ash stayed, still tied to the fireplace, to Ellie's small hands, to the giggles that filled the house. But as sweet as Ash was, the family knew. Ember was the beginning and the end. In the days that followed, the house fell strangely silent. The mother tidied the basket where Ember used to sleep, but nothing was placed in it, as if it had to remain empty, to wait or to preserve something sacred. The father mounted a small wooden sign near the door, "For Ember, thank you." And beneath that sign, the snow always lay untouched. No returning prints, no promises. Spring came, then summer. Life went on. Ash grew quickly, healthy, and bonded to the family like a half-domesticated wildcat. But none of them forgot Ember. Not from longing, but because her presence had carved a mark into memory, like a claw scratch on soft wood, shallow but permanent. Ellie hung a drawing she made on her bedroom wall, a bobcat standing in snowy woods, golden eyes turned toward the light. In the picture, the sun shone down from the top left corner, casting a warm streak along her back. That's when Ember was about to leave, she explained. But Mom, I don't think she was sad. I think she found her way. And the mother could only nod, because deep down she believed it too. 3 years passed. Ash had grown. Not the kitten who curled up in blankets anymore. He wandered the porch, sometimes disappearing for days, then returning with small scratches on his ear, or fur soaked by forest rain. The family accepted it because they understood that some creatures would always carry a part of the wild in their hearts. Just like Ember. Then came another winter, colder than usual. Snow began falling in mid-October. Ellie, now 9, sat by the window holding a small notebook where she wrote, "The times I missed Ember." The first page read, "The first time I met Ember, she was smaller than my teddy bear. Her eyes were sad, but still so beautiful." The last page read, "I don't think Ember disappeared. I think she just went far away. One day she'll return, even if only in the wind or in my dreams. And then, one day, it happened. Quietly, without warning. The whole family was sitting by the fire. Outside, snow fell gently, fine as powder. Ellie held Ash, now dozing in her lap, her hand sketching idly in the notebook. The mother was knitting. The father held an old book, occasionally glancing at the fogged window pane. Suddenly, Ash stirred. He lifted his head, ears alert, eyes focused on the window, not afraid, just attentive. Then he padded silently toward the door. The mother lowered her hands, yarn slipping to the floor. She stood and walked quietly to the window. Outside, across the snowy yard, a familiar figure stood still. Thinner, stronger, thick fur, golden with dark stripes, ears standing straight like two small arrows, and those eyes, still golden, still deep, still calm, like a mountain lake. It was Ember. She didn't come closer, just stood there, looking in, for a long while. Then behind her, two tiny forms peeked out, baby bobcats. One big, one small, both with fur the same color as Ember, the same stance, the same cautious gaze. The mother placed a hand over her heart. It beat in aching, steady thuds. No one said a word. Ember stood there, quiet as a star just past the horizon, then slowly turned and walked back into the forest, not hurried, not afraid. The two bobcat kittens followed, but before disappearing into the pines, the smallest one stopped. It turned its head, looked back toward the porch, then ran a few steps toward it, placed a paw on the first wooden step, paused, set one tiny foot right where Ember had once lain, exactly where the old wool scarf had been spread. Then it turned and ran after its mother and sibling, gone into the forest. The mother stepped outside, beneath her feet, on the freshly fallen snow. A single paw print, clear and distinct. And she knew, without a word. Ember had come back. Not to stay, but to introduce, to close the circle. After that day, they never saw Ember again. But the mother didn't grieve, because in her heart, she understood. Ember was never just a story of rescue. She was a story of trust returned. A wild creature, once trembling beneath a stranger's roof, then growing strong and returning, not to be saved, but to give. One last time. Years later, people began telling tales about the mother lynx of the Western Ridge, a creature that never attacked, yet always lingered near little houses like a silent guardian. No one knew where she came from. Only 3 people in an old wooden cabin understood, because they had once opened a door and received a lifetime of change in return. 10 years passed. The mother now had silver strands at her temples. Ellie, now 19, was preparing to leave the cabin she'd grown up in, heading off to university in a city hundreds of miles away. Ash was gone. He had grown old, weary, and on a winter night the year before, had lain down on the porch and never risen again. The cabin still stood among the same pine trees, its dark brown roof slanted, wooden walls cracked with time but warm and steady, like a patient heart that kept beating no matter how many winters passed. The mother had kept everything just the same. The old basket still sat by the fireplace, empty, untouched. The drawing Ellie made at 8 still hung in the living room, faded but remarkably alive. On the north wall, carved by Ellie one spring afternoon, were the words, "Some wild things still remember." No one ever erased it, because they all believed it was true. One early autumn day, when the first leaves began turning orange, the mother went walking alone in the forest. She brought nothing with her but the old wool scarf, the first shelter Ember had ever known. The scarf was frayed now, torn in places, but still carried a faint scent of burning wood, dry grass, and memory. She had no purpose. Just a chilly afternoon and a heart pulled gently towards something unknown. It had been years since she last saw Ember. No sightings, no tracks, but sometimes on rainy nights, she still felt as if she heard something. Soft steps on wood or a small breath beside the door. Not clear, but never cold. It felt like the breath of someone once dear. She stopped in a clearing, a place where she used to sit with Ellie, where Ember had brought ash for the first time. It all felt like yesterday. She sat down, laid the scarf across her lap, ran her hand gently over its worn threads, eyes gazing far away. Every time winter nears, she thought, my heart stirs like deer waking from sleep, as if waiting for someone. No words, no images, just a feeling deep in her chest. A part of her had never left that winter, the day a small creature stepped onto their porch and changed everything. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. And in the stillness of the autumn woods, she heard something. Not footsteps, not wind, just a presence. She opened her eyes. Across from her, some dozens of paces away, between two towering maple trees, amber eyes watched her. Deep, still, as if time itself paused. She didn't move. Her breath remained steady. She couldn't say it was Ember. She couldn't be sure. The creature stood far off, but that gaze, one only those who've seen it before could recognize, was the gaze etched into her heart 10 years ago. Then it vanished. No sound, no trace, but no need to come closer, because what needed to be given had already been sent. When the mother returned home, twilight had fallen. She placed the wool scarf back in the basket, said nothing to anyone. But that night, when Ellie entered her room, she found a small letter on her pillow written in her mother's hand. It read, "There are kinds of love that don't need tending. A single touch is enough to last a lifetime. Go, live fully, love fiercely. And when you're weary, remember, in those woods there is a wild heart you once saved, and it has never forgotten." Ellie folded the letter and pressed it to her chest. She knew she would carry this forever, not to retell, but to continue living. The way a bobcat once survived winter and returned, carrying the gentlest gift. A grown woman, now a veterinarian, returned to the old cabin in the woods with her young daughter. The little girl had the same brown eyes and the same loving heart as her mother. They sat together on the porch, beneath the pine canopy still as green as ever. And as the wind gently stirred the air, the little girl asked, "Mom, did you ever raise a wild cat?" The mother smiled, then pointed to the old basket by the fireplace. The wool scarf was still there. There are wild things that pass through our lives to remind us that kindness doesn't need applause, love doesn't need to be held tightly, and the things sown in tenderness will always find their way home. If someone were to ask, what could a single wild cat change in a person's life? We could smile and say, not much, but just enough. just enough to turn a cold porch into a home, just enough to soften a closed-off heart one more time, just enough for a child to learn that kindness doesn't need to be returned right away, and just enough for even the wildest souls to learn to trust, to return, and to leave behind love. Ember wasn't the only creature out there needing a door to open. Across America, there are thousands, tens of thousands of small, lost beings. Stray cats, abandoned forest animals, eyes searching for someone to pause, bend down and reach out. They don't need a miracle. They just need a chance. And maybe you are the one who can offer it. If you've ever rescued a creature, ever offered it warmth, please share that story. Because maybe your story will be the reason someone else opens their door today without hesitation. If you've ever regretted not being able to keep one longer, remember this: true love always leaves a trace. Somewhere, in a forest or in someone's heart. And if you've never had the chance, then maybe today is the first day. Spread a small act of kindness. Share this video if your heart has ever stirred because of a small, fragile creature. Comment below about a miracle you once witnessed between humans and animals. Send this story to someone you believe may have an ember of their own. Because love doesn't need to be tamed, it just needs to be trusted. And sometimes, the smallest thing you do, it is the one someone remembers forever.